Some of you may have watched our video on Buyer Beware, where we discovered some severe settlement in our house after closing, as you can tell by the large crack behind me. Well, today we're going to try to start fixing that. The first step in this process was actually determining that there was settlement of the foundation, which after ripping onto this wall, finding the cracks, measuring the elevation change, it was very obvious. Then we went and we got foundation companies to give us quotes. Now, because my specialty is aerospace engineering and not structural engineering, I hired an independent structural engineer to overlook the quotes and to look at the stem walls and the foundation to give me his professional opinion. And I would recommend that to anybody, especially if in the home inspection they find cracks. A little too late for me, but that structural engineer was a key in me basically taking those quotes that went up all the way to $47,000 and get them down to about $30,000 because they tended to want to put a lot more work in there than need be. And some of the work was somewhat questionable, so me and the engineer just struck those quotes out and said, we're going to go with a different company. So that was a great process. Now we're down to one foundation company. I think they have a great plan, and they're going to use some helicals. So we're going to look at that today, how they're installed and how they actually work. Now we're down in the basement, and this particular company has decided to put the helicals on the inside. It's a little bit easier to access here because I have about 8 to 9 feet of dirt outside, plus bushes, as well as a front stoop that needs to be taken out. Digging in sand is not an easy option. Because we have so much room down here, certainly cutting through concrete is not easy, but it's easier than digging 9-foot holes on the outside every 5 to 8 feet. So they've elected to come inside to make their work a little bit easier. It also is inside from the weather, and we get rain and thunderstorms every single day here. So this should go pretty quickly without any weather delays. Now, they've marked these out every 5 to 8 feet, starting from where the house begins to settle. Behind the camera, that stem wall is not settled at all. It starts here about 2 feet right of that mark. And so they're going to start the helicals here, go down every 5 to 8 feet all the way to the corner, wrap around the house, and we'll have a total of 15 helicals in place. So when I use the term helical, this is what I'm talking about. It's like a giant screw that goes into the ground. Now the quote says 25 feet or less, most likely before they hit solid ground. But what they can do is continue to put extensions on it to get as deep as they need to get before they hit solid earth. Now these are screwed in normally by this mini excavator. However, because they're going to do mine inside, they have an attachment right up front there that goes to a power cart that they'll roll into the basement, and they'll get these things screwed in. Once they're screwed in, they'll have hydraulic jacks on the top of these. They're going to push the footer up and hopefully lift the house. We'll see how it works. The first step in the process was to cut through the concrete slab about 18 by 18 inch squares so that they could dig out to the footer and get the helicals in there. Now they had to do 15 of these, so it took quite a while to cut all of those holes in the concrete. Once all those squares were cut, they took a jackhammer and they broke up the concrete to pull those squares out and get to the dirt below the slab. This was quite a bit of work too because it was all done by hand. Okay, the contractor's inside working, I'm outside working. It's a really busy day and it's super noisy. They just stopped the saw, so I'm going to be quick with this. These are actually the top of the helicals. These will actually go up underneath the footer of the house, and then they will be able to use these screws to press down on the top of the helical and press up on the footer. So these go on the very top of the helicals. We'll see how those work a little bit later. As it turns out, that skid steer was actually small enough to get into my basement. So although most of the digging was done by hand, the skid steer certainly helped out to get those holes well evacuated. You'll see in this next picture, the first hole and actually the second hole also developed a little seepage of water in the bottom. But it wasn't up to the footer, it was well below the footer, but that probably caused some issues later on with some suction that prevented lift. But you can see here, you can see right under the footer of the house. Helicals are going in. These things look heavy.
Oh yeah, that's very light.
This shows you how deep the holes are. And you can see that they go under the footer. Now these first two holes, we actually had water come up in there. So they're going to have to drill these down to get solid ground, get below that water table area there. Now, once they got all 15 of these put into the holes, it turns out they were able to use this little Kubota for all the screwing, which was very helpful. Now, it goes in quite at an angle here to get the flutes past the footer. Once the flute gets past the footer, they actually straighten it out, and from that point, they will put extensions on. Each extension is about 4.5 feet. So some of these holes took 2 extensions, some took 3. I believe one even took 4 extensions, but it was all dependent on how much hydraulic pressure was being used to screw those in. Once it hit 1500 psi, they knew that the ground was solid enough to hold the weight of the house, and they stopped. Well, the workers finished up for the day. I wanted to take the opportunity to demonstrate how this clamp actually works and how it pushes the footer up. Now, this is not totally screwed in, it's just sitting in there, but I wanted to utilize this helical, the top of it, to show you how this fits on there. So this contraption here, this part right here goes underneath the footer, So when I drop this on, you can see that this plate rests on top of the helical. And if I screw these screws down, then this platform raises up, okay? So if I'm pushing down on the pier, I am thus pushing up on the footer. And that's how it secures the footer and can even lift the footer up. These are 1-inch bolts, so you can get a lot of upward force by screwing those down. I wanted to get a picture of the bracket when it's first dropped into the hole. Obviously it's dropped in sideways because that large base plate there that goes under the footer here needs to be rotated in place. It needs to be turned 90 degrees so it's underneath that footer. Once all the brackets were in place, the next step was to tighten down the bolts. Now, to give you an idea of the lifting force they can create with those bolts, the contractor told me it was grade 8 steel. And a 1-inch bolt can be torqued down about 800 foot-pounds and provide around 50,000 pounds of clamping force. And there's 2 of those, so that's 100,000 pounds. However, you're limited by that top plate, which is about 3/4-inch steel. So it's going to start bending before that, and you could potentially buckle the helical pier below. So your limiting factor is not actually the bolt. But the contractor should monitor the torque to know how much lifting force he's actually getting on the footer, because it's directly proportional to torque. And I went ahead and flooded these holes because it helps wash the dirt back up under the footer from where they put these in. And that way you get a good pack when you get this dirt back in there, and then concrete goes on top. The next step was to actually inject foam underneath the slab, because the slab had moved too when the house had settled. So it's like 1/10 the weight of concrete, but the same strength or something?
Essentially, yeah.
Pretty
It
impressive.
expands 15 times its volume.
That equipment trailer was actually parked on the street, and they had a 200-foot insulated hose that went down into the basement, so there was no heavy equipment down there. Now, once the footer is stabilized, this will also fill any voids that are caused by lifting that up in the process. You can see the level he has on the ground, and they simply drilled holes in the concrete about every 3 feet and began to monitor the movement of the slab as they put the foam in there. The very last step was actually concreting all those squares shut and shoveling and vacuuming out all the dirt from the basement. The contractors did a great job. All right, the finishing touch is basically just go back and fill in all the cracks that were on the wall, the foundation cracks that were there before. Now, we do this for 2 reasons. First of all, make sure there's no water penetration coming through the wall, but the other thing is, this work is actually warranted for the lifetime of the house. It's transferable to new owners.
it is stabilized now. This house should not move, and if it does, they will come back. So you can monitor it by seeing if you get any more cracks. I will also monitor it by checking any elevation changes and have them come back if that does anything. And the big question is, was there any movement upward? Well, unfortunately, we didn't get much, probably about 3/4 of an inch on that low side. Now, there's several reasons for that. Contractors, in all the contracts that we looked at, none of them guaranteed that they would actually move the house back to its original location. Sometimes that happens, other times it doesn't. Most likely in this case, I talked to the contractor, because we had water under the footer and that earth down there was a lot of sandy clay, most likely you have suction. Basically, if you have a rock sitting on wet clay or maybe a boogie board on the beach and you try to pick it up, there's suction because of that water there. Most likely that's what we were seeing. Now, how could you remedy that? Well, technically, I guess you could tighten them up and then continue to tighten them every day for a week or so, and you might break that suction. But the contractor is an in and out type of thing, so they're obviously not going to wait around to do something like that. But again, the house is completely stable and warranted for life. So any leveling I need to do upstairs with the floor, with the door frames, with the windows, that can all be done now, because once those are squared off and leveled off, they should stay that way. Well, thanks again for watching. We love the comments. If you've gone through this process or you used another method, let us know. Put it in the comments. We love to read those comments, and it helps other people when making this decision. We'll see you next time.